Welcome to our annual Title IX training. My name is Rachel Monfett, and I serve as the Associate Dean of Students for Moody Chicago and the Title IX Coordinator. As a Christian institution of higher learning, Moody seeks to foster interactions that encourage an atmosphere of respect for all members of the Moody community and an educational and work environment free from sex-based misconduct. To this end, Moody expects members of the Moody community to comply with legal requirements as well as higher standards of conduct consistent with our belief in Jesus Christ, which elevates our view of human worth, dignity, and interpersonal communication. Sex-based misconduct is a tough yet very important topic. It's important that we speak of this issue through the lens of our shared faith in Jesus Christ. If you have experienced or witnessed sex-based misconduct at Moody, the Title IX office is a resource for you to report the misconduct and to receive beneficial resources for support and healing. You can submit this report in a number of different ways. You can email title9@moody.edu. You can call 312-329-4106. If you're on the Chicago campus, you can stop by my office on Culbertson 2 or send an anonymous report through the mail or campus post office. We take all reports received seriously. If an investigation becomes necessary, it will be conducted fairly, thoroughly, timely, and professionally. The Title IX policy you will need to read prior to November 10th will give you more details about the process, but if you have any questions as you read, please do not hesitate to ask. And as you'll read in the policy, there is amnesty for conduct that violates the student life guide for reports that are received of sex-based misconduct. While we don't want to overlook the things that may have been happening in connection with the sex-based misconduct, we think that it's more important, like if there's alcohol being used or if there's consensual sexual activity, it's more important to us that any sort of misconduct or conduct outside of consent is handled and addressed. And so we'll treat that with care and take that into consideration as we go through the process. I'd like to invite Dr. John Foubert to come up. He is our speaker for this year's training. If you were here last year, you will remember him. He serves as the national president for the nonprofit organization 1 in 4. He's an endowed professor of college student development at Oklahoma State University and is principal of John Foubert, LLC. Dr. Foubert is an interdisciplinary scholar with over 50 peer-reviewed publications. He's written 7 books about the prevention of sexual violence and 2 about managing life in college residence halls. His 10th book, which came out this year, is titled How Pornography Harms, What Teens, Young Adults, Parents, and Pastors Need to Know. And he'll be doing an event tonight in Alumni Auditorium from 7 to 8:30. So come and hear more about this book and the important topic. Dr. Foubert has testified in Congress and has been called on by the White House and Pentagon for his scholarly expertise. He consults with colleges and military regularly about the harms of pornography and ending sexual violence. And more than anything, Dr. Foubert is a child of God and a follower of Jesus. Please help me welcome him.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for sharing your time with me. I really do consider that to be your most valuable resource, is your time. So thank you all for sharing that with me. It's a joy and just an honor to stand here in front of you. I can remember maybe 5-10 years ago watching a YouTube clip of, I believe it was Josh McDowell speaking from here, and I saw him speak there and I was like, boy, that's one place I'll never be. And then there's the phrase, but God. There should be a lot more of that in my bio. I'm now realizing it sounds a little self-aggrandizing. Yes, she spoke to the White House and the Pentagon. It's like, God opened every single one of those doors, and it amazes me the sorts of opportunities I'm able to have. But these are my favorite opportunities, to talk to students on Christian college campuses, largely because I have always been called to work on a secular campus. I've never worked on a Christian college campus, let alone get a degree from one. So I do hope that you all remain continuously thankful for the environment that you have here. I don't pretend that it's perfect, but you do have a Christian community that is here, and those are so important. And so what I want to talk about today actually is how do we go deeper within Christian community to make them deeply caring, more so than they might be. How do we apply the love of Christ and the message of Christ to that? And particularly when people, and I was on a roll with C's here, as you can see, capitalize on carnal coercion. Essentially what I'm saying there, when someone capitalizes on something, they take advantage of it. Carnal coercion, convincing someone to do something with their body that they don't want to do. So I'm here to talk about sexual violence and other types of sexual misconduct. I'm also here to talk a little bit about pornography. I'll talk a lot about pornography this evening, and I do hope to see just as many of you there as well. But we're going to talk about some difficult topics. And so because of that, I especially want to say, take care of you being number one here. If you need to get up and leave for something, I think we can all assume that person had to go to class, they had another meeting, whatever, they had to go to the restroom, whatever it might be. Talk to someone you trust, and know that I'll be using some descriptive, semi-graphic language. I'm not going to gratuitously swear or something like that. That would just be incredibly awkward. But I don't think you can really clean up the topic of rape. Or pornography for that matter. So there'll be times when I'm pretty descriptive, and it's just because if we can't talk about sin in church or at a Christian college, where can we talk about it? So that's where I'm coming from. And of course, this isn't legal advice. Thank goodness I'm not an attorney. I love attorneys, I'm just not one. I don't want to be one. One of my thoughts as I put together this talk was, if only we lived as God commanded. And if only we lived as God commanded, there'd be no sexual violence, there'd be no pornography, there'd be no sin. But our place in time, as we all know, is after the fall and before the return of Christ. So these are the cards we've been dealt. Okay, we live in a sinful world, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it'll be until Christ returns. And in fact, I think a reading of Scripture could convince us it's going to get worse. And I think we're already seeing that, really. We're also called to love. And certainly throughout Scripture, we're told how to love and who to love. And pretty much everyone is covered under one of the four categories I have up here. I think it's probably most difficult to love our enemies, at least it is for me. But we're supposed to love God, our neighbor, other believers, and our enemies. And it's through that love that I think is ultimately the antidote to addressing issues like sexual violence and pornography. And that might seem like an odd connection to be making, but I do believe that it is an important one, because throughout time, one of the things that Christians have done is we understand deep moral values, we understand the sanctity of human life, we understand that every life is made in the image of God. So if that's true, then one of the things we need to do in loving each other is to make sure if something bad is going to happen to another person and we realize that, we need to do the ambiguous thing and stand up, step in, and say, no, that's not going to happen now. Or if someone says, hey, this has happened to me, and I'm struggling with this, we walk alongside that individual. We don't say, well, what were you doing there in the first place? Okay? So I think that all ties into who we're supposed to love. Now, I think we could also do a whole lot better job. I'm guessing you all have prayer lists and such and things that you pray about. I wonder, and I doubt it's too high, I wonder how many people pray for an end to rape. Some of you probably do. I wonder how many of you pray for an end to the pornography industry. And I'm guessing some of you do, but I think more of you should. Because I do know that the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. And I meet a lot of righteous people at Moody. You're a special place, and you will always have a special place in my heart. But I think that if we actually do pray for strength, one of the things that we can do is have the strength to enter into situations where we might not otherwise, we certainly don't want to put ourselves at risk, but we might not otherwise, and we can help prevent sexual violence. We can confront a friend who's using pornography and say, you need to stop doing that and I'm going to help you. So right now, the rate of sexual assault on Christian college campuses, as far as we can tell, is lower than at secular campuses. That's not a news flash. That's not a real surprise. But I believe that we can decrease that because right now we're at about 2.5% of women on Christian college campuses experiencing rape or attempted rape every year. And to be perfectly honest with you, there's absolutely no excuse for that being anything above zero. Number one, because no one at a Christian college should ever stoop to such a level as to intervene and not intervene, but to step in and violate someone's bodily integrity. And secondly, we should, to the extent possible, be conscious of things that other people are doing and realizing that guy doesn't look like his motives are pure. Maybe it's time to take him for a walk and throw him into a cold shower or something like that. I throw those things in just to make sure you're still paying attention. I also think that if we used our love, particularly our love for our neighbor, we can make a big dent in the level of sexual violence outside the Christian community. And I think that's important because, when I get involved and I go to different sexual assault conferences, sexual assault prevention conferences, there are almost no believers there, like hardly any at all. And occasionally we find each other and it's like, oh, I can breathe for a minute. But we need more Christians who are willing to be involved in ending sexual violence. We need more Christians praying for an end to sexual violence. And I think we can really make a big dent in sexual violence. Now, I've been thinking about love a lot recently, and I've been thinking of it as a weapon. And that might sound kind of strange. Well, love a weapon? Well, yeah, I think it can be because it's so interestingly disarming to your foe. Turning the other cheek in love is quite disarming. And it's also very mighty to a fellow believer that when they have experienced something that's sin, but you come right alongside them with love and you're like, I'm going to fight this with you. I think those are both very powerful. Now, the most powerful sense of love we really know is that in the Trinity, which was made in the beginning and before everything was made. And of course, God the Father isn't the only one that made everything. When we look at Genesis 1:26, it plainly says, let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness. It doesn't say, I will, I will, I will. It's us. It's our. So we know the Trinity was alive and in community before everything was created, and it's that force of community within the Trinity that created everything. And so if there's that much force and power in community, can't we model that in our own relationships and see what we can create and see what good that we can do? So I do believe it's our responsibility to press on to greater and deeper levels of community. It's time for us to take off those comfortable masks that we wear, especially if we're in a worship service or in a church or whatever. It's like, well, maybe I can talk about the fact that I have an idol in my life, but I'd never turn to the person next to me and say I'm struggling with pornography. I think we need to be a little bit more real with each other, because the fact is so many people do struggle with things that are serious, and I think Satan really likes it when we feel shame and keep things to ourselves. And we need to fight back. And I do believe we fight evil, essentially, with love, that we can actually use that as a weapon. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that Satan spawned the creation of rape and pornography and certainly sin. And we should understand both of them as evil, which means we should be very cautious as we enter into those topics. I mean, rape would happen when someone decides their motivation to violate the bodily integrity of someone else matters more than that other person's desire to maintain their bodily integrity as someone made in the image of God. Pornography, of course, represents a very raw, unrealistic, violent corruption of that which God created to be good. So we got a lot to fight. Now, I keep coming back to this theme of community because I think it's so important that we form stronger communities to fight. It's sort of like we need a rally cry before we go to war. We need to become a stronger community before we can do spiritual battle. My favorite theologian is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I hope that doesn't put me at odds with all of you if you're all like, Bonhoeffer, rare, something like that. Is there any Bonhoeffer fan in the crowd? A couple? All right. Okay, all right. Whew. Okay. All right. So one of my favorite books by Bonhoeffer is Life Together. Great book on community. And by the way, I love this call and response thing. It's like, yeah. All right, so what he says, seriously, is between the death of Christ and the last day, it's only by a gracious anticipation of the last things that Christians are privileged to live in visible fellowship with other Christians. It is by the grace of God that a congregation is permitted to gather visibly in this world to share God's word and sacrament. Not all Christians receive this blessing. The imprisoned, the sick, the scattered lonely, the proclaimers of the gospel in heathen lands stand alone. He went on to say the physical presence of other Christians is a source of incomparable joy and strength to the believer. And I feel that very deeply. In fact, I feel that every time I walk on a Christian college campus. I feel that joy because anytime I walk into my office, I'm looking for the flaming arrows that might be hitting me. And that's okay. That's where God's placed me. But I did want to share with you, because I think it is relevant, that there is a very powerful sense of Christian community that can do very powerful things. I was invited to come here last year, and one of the presentations I gave was to your student life, your student development staff. And for whatever reason, the Lord led me towards the end to share some of my own vulnerabilities with the people in that room, my own concerns, my own worries, my worries about being attacked by Satan. And in sharing that vulnerability, as soon as our session was over, the entire room stood and went around me, laid on hands, and prayed. And I wept. There was nothing else that I could do. And I've had meaningful experiences in my life. I'd certainly count being married and having my 2 children, being born among them. But in terms of being meaningful and moving, that comes next. And you have a very powerful spiritual community here. And that's one of the reasons why I really wanted to come back. Heck, I hope I can come back every year. But I really want you all to use the energy that you have of being committed to the Lord, committed to prayer, committed to fighting the good fight, to help fighting the 2 battles that I'm talking about today, and I know that you can. So how do we look when we're in fellowship? Certainly we look and should look different from the world. I think that ultimately, I believe it was, I'll get to that later, but we do look different and we act different from the world. We're certainly called to be different from the world. And you all know that, I know very well. And in community and in fellowship, we find the strength to do the battles that we need to fight. And when I think we're really in that fellowship and community, we then have the energy to say or do something we might normally do. If someone, you're in a group of people and someone's being incredibly demeaning to a woman and calling her things that he shouldn't be calling her, maybe it's time to say, you know what? We don't tolerate that kind of talk in our community, and we don't allow a child of God to be treated like that, so why don't you back off? And I bet you all can say that. And we certainly shouldn't be a passive bystander and think, well, someone else will intervene, someone else will do something, it's not my responsibility. It's all of our responsibility, and there is strength in numbers. It's also our responsibility in fellowship to walk carefully alongside the suffering. I think we're really good at walking alongside the sick in the hospital, but how often are we good at walking alongside the traumatized on the college campus? To avoid community is to be foolish. And one of the things that I read recently was by Andy Stanley, and he said, our enemy's most successful strategy is to isolate us so he can attack and destroy us. Sheep are never attacked in herds. They're attacked when they're isolated from the flock. So why might a shepherd go after the lost sheep? Because that lost sheep is vulnerable. Our shepherd goes after us when we're lost because we're vulnerable. And where does that sheep need to return? To the flock, where they're safer, not 100% safe, we can't say that, but where they're safer, where they can avoid danger, and frankly, where they can recover, because we know what the community looks like through our following of Christ and the model of the Trinity. There's a very interesting study that came out, and it was a longitudinal study. They studied people for 9 years. And one of the things they wanted to know, and this all relates to community, they wanted to know what are sorts of the variables in there that lead people to die, frankly. If you wait 9 years in a study, somebody's going to die. And what they found was, very interestingly, people who were socially isolated were 3 times more likely to die in that 9 years than other people. Can you imagine that? People are socially isolated, it's actually deadly. And then they went further along in the studies because they assumed, well, if someone has bad health habits, of course, they're going to die sooner. Well, in and of itself, yes, of course. But if that person with bad health habits had strong social ties, they died later. And if someone had great health habits but they were isolated, they died sooner. So what this really tells us is community is life-sustaining, it's powerful, and it's a deeply spiritual thing. I want to talk about the threat to the church, and what I believe today is the number one threat to the church, and I'll leave no doubt in your mind as to what that is. Right now, the availability of high-speed internet pornography is the number one threat to the church in the United States and probably in many other countries. I make that statement as an opinion based on research, but I can't say, well, this is an absolute fact. But I can tell you that I do believe it very strongly. I believe it because it is pervasive and it is taking people down. And it is affecting people far more than we might ever think. So who is this affecting? Well, it's affecting pastors. Affecting pastors because a lot of them are afraid to say that they struggle or have ever struggled or are currently using. Now, one of the things that just tends to annoy me beyond the point where I can stand still, which maybe is why I'm walking, is the statistic that's been put out there that 70 to 80% of pastors are addicted to pornography. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard that statistic? Okay, some of you have. Get it out of your mind, because it is basically equivalent to a study made of excrement. The actual statistic is about 15%. Should we be concerned about those 15% who think they're addicted to pornography? You better believe we should. But we're not talking about 70 to 80% of pastors today. Think about the porn industry wants to send several messages out to us in particular and the general public. They want us to think that women love acting in porn. They don't, they hate it. They want us to believe that pastors are using porn all the time. They want us to believe that Utah is the state where the highest use of porn is because they hate Mormons, they being the porn industry. There are a lot of Mormons who fight the porn industry. And so there are lots of statistics that just get thrown out there all over the place. So we need to be careful to use our discernment with those. Certainly church leaders, I think they have a target on their head. And we need to be praying for them very much. Bible scholars, obviously, may struggle with porn. Students, most of you in this room are students. I know from talking to more students than I can possibly ever imagine, and for doing research on students, how big and how real the struggle is. There is no generation in the history of time who's been under more spiritual attack than yours. Because that level of access to something that frankly is very enticing and appeals to part of our just being a human being is so available in our pockets. The world's supply of pornography is on every iPhone. It's not something people have to go out of their way to get. Certainly many others, and we could name them forever, but I do believe that the spiritual health of the church is at stake. And I do believe that we have the power to stop it, and the number one weapon in our arsenal is prayer, and we haven't been doing that enough. So let's pray for an end to pornography. Now, I wanted to give you at least a little bit of a preview of some of the stuff that I'll be talking about this evening. This is a nationwide Barna study of Christians and how frequently they use pornography. You add up for men several times a week and once a month, and you get to 64%. So you got about 2/3 of men who identify as Christian in this country who are looking at porn at least once a month. That's pathetic. Okay? We need to do something about that. About 15% of women, and the porn industry is targeting women, they're trying to increase that figure. If you go to secular statistics, you get up to 42% of women are looking once a month, and a little bit more men than Christian men, but not a lot. It's kind of an interesting finding. We don't really know why, we just kind of know what. But there are a lot of people who are using. Now, I would also take a step back from this study and say I don't always agree with the way that Barna measures what a Christian is, because it can be, items that can be, are you Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Mormon, blah, blah, whatever. So, at any rate, but people who identify as Christians, that's a statistic. Now, who does pornography affect? Everybody. It doesn't matter if you're using it or not. It does matter if you're using it. That certainly would affect you. But I did several different studies because one of the things I wanted to know was, how does knowing people who use pornography affect people's lives? And particularly because I study sexual violence, I wanted to know, does someone's use of pornography affect at all whether they're going to intervene to help prevent a sexual assault from occurring if someone's in trouble? And lo and behold, both men and women are affected in that way. Both men and women who use more pornography are much less likely to intervene to help prevent a sexual assault if they see that it's imminent. Part of the reason why I think that is the case is that pornography tends to show such a violent depiction of what intercourse might be, is that when someone who's used a lot of it sees something like that could be happening, it's like, well, violence and sex go together. I don't know if I should be concerned. And that is deeply concerning. So Satan, I think, really wants to destroy what God created good. I have I'm pretending this is Adam and Eve here. It's not a real picture of Adam and Eve, but we'll pretend that that's Adam and Eve. And obviously, God knew what he was doing when he created marital relations between husband and wife. He knew that it would bond people physically, spiritually, that it would be something that would produce joy, not just happiness, but joy. And Satan saw that and he's like, I got to get in the middle of some of that because joy is not happening on my watch. So let's throw a little porn in and distract them from each other and undermine it as much as possible. And I think it's our responsibility to fight back on that front, because God created what he created as good, and Satan is directly trying to undermine that. So where are we right now as a culture? Our rate of rape, it's never been higher. I expect it to increase further. I say that because it was steady from about the 80s until about 5 years ago, and I'm starting to see a couple studies come out suggesting it's increasing. And there could be any number of reasons for that. Porn use, never been higher. Pornography essentially is a recipe for rape. I'll unpack that argument this evening and give you the reasons why. Violence in porn has never been more extreme. And that sets up situations where people might commit rape. Human relationships have never been more cold, more distant, more impersonal. That's why I think we have an opportunity to live differently and look different from others, because we know what Christian community is. We can model what they have in the Trinity, and we can get closer to one another so we can fight better. So I also think we need to do a better job of considering an eternal perspective. So if you're talking to someone and you're saying, you know what, I noticed that you've been looking at your phone a little bit too much, and I have a feeling I know what you've been doing when you've been looking at that phone. Why don't you go buy a dumb phone instead of a smartphone? They have them now, by the way. I'm not just making that up. There's a market for phones that don't get pictures, and it's largely from Christians who don't want to have that in their pocket anymore. So I do think that's something we can do. I also think that sometimes we need to do the uncomfortable and seemingly impossible. I'm at a party with high school friends. It looks like something bad's going to go down. I just hope someone else will do something about it. Well, someone else is probably you and maybe a few friends. to stand up, step in, do the awkward thing, and not by your strength, but by His. Do something to prevent it. Too often we fail to intervene. Too often, because if it happens even once at a Christian college, I think too often people are using others for their own sexual pleasure without the permission of the other individual, in addition to all the other issues that go along with that. And certainly, I do believe that sexual assault happens at Christian colleges. One of the things that the Bible warns us about are wolves in sheep's clothing. I think there are wolves in sheep's clothing most everywhere. And while the Bible usually is referring to false prophets when it's talking about wolves in sheep's clothing, I think we can make that analogy also to men who commit rape on college campuses that are Christian. I said before, 2.5% of women on Christian college campuses experience rape, and there's no excuse for that being anything above zero. And I think we can work to that. Right now on secular campuses, it's 5% per year, so we know that it is different. One of the things that I think we clearly need is communities that breed confession. Because I think confession can be a very strong weapon that we use to fight Satan and to draw closer to God. And in James, therefore, confess your sins to one another, pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it's working. That level of prayer, knocking down the barriers of social acceptability, I can talk about this, I can't talk about that, the heck with that. Now, I'm not saying don't have any boundaries. Don't walk up to someone on the street and say, I have a porn problem, can you help me? That indeed would be awkward, and that indeed would be a little odd. But seriously, talking to your best friend about it, talking to another friend about it, yes, it's time. If you haven't already, it's time. We also need to be more comfortable getting into other people's business. We don't need to be gossiping, that is not at all what I'm saying, but we need to get into other people's business. If we know that one of our friends is using pornography, why haven't we taken away his cell phone yet? You'd take away keys from a drunk who keeps drunk driving, but we need to take away the cell phone of the person and take them to a store and say, we need a dumb phone. Because I think that's extremely important. We need to have a posture of being ready to help and ready to stand up and step in if something bad's going to happen, and that doesn't come naturally to all of us, but it has to come as behavior for many more of us. And I would ask you the rhetorical questions. Does it honor God to mind our own business when we see someone in our community who's being harassed by another person? Does it honor God when we see someone else who's being manipulated by another person in any way, whether it's sexually or physically or otherwise, and just say, I hope someone else does something about that. They should really do something about that. No, you should really do something about that. Let's not make two victims. I'm not saying enter a situation in which there'll be two victims instead of one, but let's figure out a way, whether that's calling for help, whether that's getting other people involved, stepping into the awkward, ambiguous place, and using His strength to get through that. Now, I imagine, when I go to secular campuses, what we usually talk about in terms of ways to intervene and times to intervene is your essential drunk hookup. Now, I imagine that has happened at Moody, although I doubt it happens very frequently, just given the nature of your culture. But I do believe that you have the opportunities to help someone who might have a porn habit to get out of it. I do believe that you have opportunities with people who might be treating others, especially women, with a lack of respect. I think we need to do less ignoring and more informing others that kind of behavior is not going to be okay in our community and that we won't tolerate it. If your name is Sam, I apologize because I'm going to use a hypothetical Sam here for a minute. But so I guess a few of you can hate me, but I really hope you just understand. Let's say you have a friend and his name is Sam, and he's like, you know what? I really don't think there's anything wrong with masturbation. In fact, I think it's actually good for you, and there's nothing wrong with a little bit of porn. What do you think? My first response would be, what part of lust do you not understand? And where in the Bible do you find reason to believe that what you're doing is okay? Because can you really have masturbation and look at porn without lust? I don't think so. And God's pretty clear on those. And maybe you know a Sam who is with a young lady and says, you know what, we've been together long enough, I'm going to leave you unless you do this sexual thing with me. It's time to tell Sam to back off and get away. Now, you may not be in the room at the time, but you may hear him talking about what he plans to do. And sometimes when people talk about what they plan to do, it's bravado, but sometimes it's actually what they do plan to do. And we have an opportunity to say, hey, back off. That's not what we put up with here. Not okay. Why is porn such a problem? It's such a problem for lots of reasons. One is it's unavoidable. You can't not see it in this culture, because it's in our faces all the time. It's enticing, it's influential. It certainly leads to worse marital relations, and it's also, one of the things I learned in writing a book about it, devastating to the people in the industry. The degree to which they're abused. I talked to one woman who grew up in Chicago, and she grew up in some places you're probably familiar with, although I doubt that you visit there very much unless you're doing ministry. And she was raped at a young age, and I could just go on and on about how horrible her life was. Well, she was tricked into going into the porn industry, and she really was tricked. And after she got in it once, it became very easy to go back again, and for a year and a half, she appeared in more films than you can shake a stick at. I heard the pain in her voice when I was talking to her about her experience. She was on the verge of suicide, but then we have God. And someone who rescues people from the porn industry called her, said, I'm going to get some money so you can feed your kids, and I'm going to help you. And now that same person who needed to be rescued is rescuing others here in Chicago. I want you to understand one thing about sexual violence that I think is extremely important. And that is the freeze response. And it happens in the brain. And very briefly, what happens when someone is sexually assaulted, the prefrontal cortex, if you look up at this sucker here, the very front of the brain shuts down due to all the chemicals the trauma chemicals essentially that go through the brain. So what is the most common reaction, and by the way, this is with both female survivors and male survivors, is that they will, when they're in a situation and they'll notice that it's dangerous, it's usually something consensual in the beginning that they're enjoying, but then, bam, something happens, and the first thing they do is freeze, like deer in the headlights, kind of dumpty-dumpty-dumpty-dump, walk across the street, see a car, deer in the headlights, like look at the headlights and try and figure out what's going on. Well, so that is usually what will happen with someone who's sexually assaulted. They'll have the deer in the headlights look, and then they have to decide their brains, because prefrontal cortex is gone now, fight, flight, or freeze. And what most often the brain decides to do to preserve life is to freeze. And there are lots of different kinds of freezes. But the person freezes and cannot move. The reason I tell you that is I want you to remember that if you have a friend who comes to you and says, some guy just did something to me and I didn't want him to do it. I couldn't believe. I didn't scream, yell, knee him in the groin. I didn't do anything. It was as if I was frozen. I couldn't move. I want you to tell that person, do not be ashamed. Do not be concerned. That was your body doing what your body is designed to do to preserve your life. It's not your fault. Please remember that. I also think one of the ways that we can fight is consent in our own activities. And for those of us who are not married, I think one of the best ways of doing that is to learn to be consensual about the small things. I think it's a profoundly intimate gesture to ask someone else, can I hold your hand? And that really is a profoundly intimate thing to do. So I would encourage that as well. As we near the end, what I want to do is I want to end in this way. Rick Warren once said, the Bible teaches that there are three kinds of storms in life. Storms that we bring on ourselves, as Samson and his troubles. Storms that God causes, and storms that other people cause, like Paul and Silas. When you are the innocent party in a crisis, that last kind of storm is especially hard to take. Storms don't play favorites. Christians have problems too. I think we as believers need to do a much better job coming alongside Christians who have problems too. We need to be more compassionate to them. We need to show love to quote-unquote sinners, like we all are, to those and those who've been sinned against. We need to get over ourselves. We need to get over our worldly influences. Ultimately, we are a people who are called by God to care. We need to model that love that's shown in the Trinity that created virtually everything there is on this earth, that can create so much more, and that we can help impact the world through that love. So in the name of Jesus Christ, I ask you to please go forth in love. Thank you very much.
Just want to end how we began this morning. Just take a moment and identify one thing you'd like to take away with you from this. I know there was a lot of information, but just ask God to help you capture something. If there are other things that you need to leave in this room, things that are painful, feel free to identify those as well. And then I'll close us in prayer. God, thank you for our community here. Thank you that we care about one another, and thank you for the tools that John has given us today to do that more effectively. I pray that whatever it is you've put in the hearts of each person in this room, that you would give them the strength and the support that they need to obey you, to follow you. In Jesus' name, amen.